The letter was brief, barely 2 pages, dated December 1942. Written in a cramped hand on thin army stationery, it began with a sentence that could have belonged to any front. They tell us to keep discipline, but it is difficult when the body has its own orders. The author, a non-commissioned officer attached to the British 8th Army in North Africa, was not describing combat, but a line of tents at the edge of a desert oasis, an officially approved brothel surrounded by wire and guarded by military police. His words capture a hidden dimension of wartime administration, the attempt to regulate desire, disease, and morality amid global conflict, from Tunis to Naples, from liberated Paris to the humid edges of the Pacific archipelagos. Soldiers and commanders confronted the same uneasy question. Could one control sexuality in the same way one controlled territory? The Second World War mobilized nearly 100 million men across continents. Alongside weapons and fuel, armies carried human impulses that military codes had long sought to contain. Venereal disease, now often called sexually transmitted infection, had threatened armies since the 19th century, but in a total war that depended upon continuous deployments and mass conscription, its potential to cripple battalions was magnified. Governments faced contradictory pressures: the need to protect troops' health and morale, moral anxieties from home fronts, and relationships with colonial or local authorities, whose customs and economies responded differently to the presence of foreign soldiers. This tension produced a patchwork of policies ranging from strict prohibition to supervised tolerance. Nowhere was that mosaic clearer than along the shifting theaters of war from 1940 to 1945. In North Africa, the British and Free French forces inherited a long French colonial system of licensed brothels, known as maisons tolérées. These establishments required women to carry medical booklets and report for examination every few days. Local doctors, often underpaid and overworked, stamped cards that allowed continued employment. When the Allied armies advanced from Egypt into Libya and Tunisia in late 1942, they co-opted this apparatus rather than dismantling it. War diaries describe military doctors distributing disinfectant kits, condoms, and pamphlets printed in Arabic, French, and English. Officially, we were to prevent sickness. Unofficially, we were to keep the men calm, paraphrased Captain John R. Hughes, a medical officer whose notes are now held in the Imperial War Museum. For soldiers passing through the desert staging areas at Benghazi or Tripoli, the rest camps that included controlled brothels blurred into the infrastructure of supply and repair. Patrons were required to wash and present a medical ticket, and nurses or female staff were checked weekly by army physicians accompanied by local police. To many commanders, this system seemed pragmatic, even humane, compared with the outbreaks of syphilis and gonorrhea that had crippled regiments during the First World War. To others, it remained a moral scandal conducted in sand-covered secrecy. Among those uneasy witnesses was Sergeant Evelyn Harper, a British Army volunteer nurse who had joined the forces in 1941 after working in a Manchester clinic. Harper, aged 32, neither radical nor prudish, became the chronicler through which we can glimpse the contradictions of policy and practice. Her surviving correspondence, preserved by her descendants, sketches the situation from the ground. "Every week brings new patients," she wrote in early 1943, paraphrased here. "They queue in the noon heat, not for wounds, but for inspection, heads down, boots full of sand." Assigned to mobile sanitary units that moved with the Eighth Army, she treated both soldiers and local women compelled to submit to medical control. Harper's letters make no open judgment, but their phrasing exposes unease at how the Army's faith in discipline collided with the private sphere of bodies. She will appear again in the chapters that follow, not as a moral interpreter, but as one human witness tracing policy through touch and observation. Italian territories, invaded by the Allies in 1943, added layers of complexity. Mussolini's regime had previously classified thousands of brothels under case chiuse, closed houses, regulated and taxed by the fascist state. When Allied military government replaced fascist authority in southern Italy, local mayors petitioned to reopen them, citing both public health and the livelihoods of women displaced by bombing. American and British administrators debated fiercely. Publicly, the U.S. War Department's directive, dated February 1943, prohibited any tolerance or supervision of prostitution under military auspices. Privately, field commanders often turned a blind eye. An informal system of red zone passes emerged. Soldiers could visit registered premises if they presented proof of recent medical inspection, typically a blue ticket certified by Army surgeons. Reports from the Naples Health Office reveal lines of men stretching around corners. Venereal disease rates declined temporarily, but moral criticism soared. Catholic clergy denounced the complicity of military officers, while local newspapers vacillated between relief at municipal revenue and outrage at foreign intrusion. In the midst of this stood health workers like Harper, transferred to Italian hospitals, where she encountered women from the same brothels now requisitioned by the Allied command. "I wash their linen and cannot forget their laughter in the corridors," she noted. An observation portrait, than judgment. The French mainland, liberated in 1944, presented yet another landscape. Paris, long famous for its maisons closes, had lived under German occupation, where the Wehrmacht had organized brothels for soldiers and officers deemed essential to morale. These German-controlled establishments were subject to strict medical oversight, with women classified as Category A or B, depending on perceived cleanliness and nationality. After liberation, French authorities dismantled the most notorious houses, while the influx of American and British troops generated new tension between moral reform and economic desperation. Local police cooperated with military medical boards to prevent what official memoranda called indiscipline and amateur prostitution. Pamphlets advised soldiers, "You defend liberty, protect it from disease." Yet night patrols in Montmartre and Marseille revealed the futility of paper rectitude. An exhausted military policeman recorded in his log, paraphrased, "We find them. They return after an hour. We forbid. They move 2 streets away." Historians later estimated that by winter 1944, roughly 80% of venereal cases among Allied troops in France came not from organized establishments, but from casual encounters beyond regulation. The attempt to govern desire through bureaucracy faltered under conditions of liberation, celebration, and loneliness. Far to the east, in the sprawling Pacific campaigns, the dynamics turned harsher. In territories occupied by Japan, the Imperial Army had institutionalized the comfort station system since the early 1930s, coercing women from Korea, China, and Southeast Asia into military brothels. By the time Allied forces advanced through New Guinea and the Philippines, reports of this system reached international ears, provoking moral horror, but also reflection on the Allies' own compromises. American commanders officially disbanded any regulated prostitution zones by mid-1944, partly to distinguish their forces from the Japanese example. Instead, they expanded medical prophylaxis programs, distributing prophylactic kits, films, and lectures. Still, informal arrangements persisted. In Australia, where US troops were stationed in large numbers, local authorities attempted to impose nightly curfews on civilian brothels, while military police opened health centers that blurred the line between medical service and sanction. An Australian radio bulletin from March 1943 stated, paraphrasing, "Camps are clean, troops well behaved, diseases declining," a claim historians now regard as more hopeful than factual. Records show that in Brisbane and Sydney, clinics sometimes treated over 50 infected soldiers a day. In these shifting geographies, command structures bent to circumstance. The same general who condemned French establishments might quietly authorize controlled houses in Algiers. The same surgeon who preached abstinence in training manuals might perform weekly inspections under a tarpaulin tent. This inconsistency was not mere hypocrisy, but a reflection of wartime pragmatism. Armies fought not only enemies, but entropy, exhaustion, fear, isolation. Prostitution, in the language of internal memos, was a pressure valve. Regulation emerged as a paradoxical form of discipline, permission wrapped in control. The tension between health policy and moral statement threaded through every communiqué from headquarters to field hospitals. For civilians living under occupation or in proximity to camps, the policies brought their own burdens. Medical testing regimes required cooperation from local police. Rumors of forced examinations circulated widely. In Tunis, a group of women petitioned the Municipal Council in 1943 to limit foreign soldiers' access, citing harassment and stigmatization. In Naples, families protested the closure of legitimate cafes that authorities feared might conceal clandestine sex work. Some earned precarious livelihoods by laundering linens or cooking for regulated houses, only to lose income when moral campaigns swept through their districts. Harper's notes from that period contain a rare reflection on civilian cost. The war teaches men to regulate disease, not poverty. The women know which is deadlier. Her words signal the broader human economy beneath official charts. Across all theaters, tensions between central directives and local governments persisted. In North Africa, French colonial officers resisted US prohibition orders, arguing they undermined established sanitary systems. In Italy, Allied governance clashed with Catholic moralists. In France, overlapping jurisdictions between municipal police, health ministries, and military provosts created bureaucratic confusion. In the Pacific, public health specialists dispatched by the US Army collaborated uneasily with Australian state authorities, who worried about moral panic among civilians. The archives reveal memos written with clinical detachment, circulars filled with words like control, containment, discipline. Behind them lay thousands of inspections, confinements, and unrecorded negotiations that defined daily life at the edges of war. The story of regulation in wartime is thus neither purely administrative nor scandalous. It belongs to the infrastructure of survival, an attempt to graft order upon the body's unpredictability. Each command post engaged in this experiment of control differently, shaped by religion, culture, and strategic necessity. To trace these variations is to glimpse how nations fought their wars not only with steel and fire, but with rules written upon flesh. Evelyn Harper's quiet testimony, joined by scattered reports from medics, officials, and civilians, offers a lens through which policy becomes human story, a story of doctors who acted as gatekeepers of virtue, of soldiers measuring desire against discipline, and of women whose identities were restitched every week into medical charts. Beyond morality and medicine lay another question, unspoken yet persistent. What happened to those who lived inside the systems once the battles moved on? Records show reductions in disease rates on certain fronts, but the cost of personal dignity and post-war recollection is harder to quantify. Later inquiries, French in 1946, American in 1948, reviewed the policies with bureaucratic detachment, rarely capturing the voices of those directly affected. To approach those voices today, historians listen through fragments. A ledger recall, a nurse's letter, a patient's whispered protest recorded in someone else's handwriting. By the spring of 1943, as armies shifted from North Africa towards southern Europe, the machinery of regulation followed them, packed into trucks beside field kitchens and radio communication sets. Harper's Unit 2 prepared to cross the Mediterranean, carrying with them records, microscopes, and the uneasy conviction that order might still be maintained across the convulsions of war. What awaited them on the European mainland, however, would test not just medical authority, but the very definitions of morality and collaboration under occupation, boundaries as mutable as any front line at that time. When the convoy arrived in Salerno in late September 1943, days after the Allied landings, the shore was still scorched with smoke and the streets filled with refugees. For the sanitary units dispatched from North Africa, including Evelyn Harper's detachment, Italy appeared both liberated and wounded. Mules dragged medical chests through the mud. Requisitioned mansions served as hospitals. Posters promised, "Clean men win wars." The task before them was neither glamorous nor optional. The command had ordered a comprehensive campaign against venereal infection among troops. Every soldier was to be inspected monthly, every contact registered, every suspect quarter mapped. The bureaucracy of health moved almost as quickly as the front line itself. By October, Allied public health officers had divided southern Italy into districts. Civilian authorities were instructed to reopen certain cases under military regulation, with guards and curfews. The reasoning was pragmatic, suppressing what one American memorandum called chaotic prostitution in ruined towns. Yet even among the officers, opinions diverged. Colonel Robert F. Adams of the U.S. Army Medical Corps wrote in his field report, paraphrased, "We fight a war against two enemies, disease and hypocrisy." He meant that each crackdown merely displaced the trade deeper into alleys or across new borders. In the hills beyond Naples, destitute families offered lodgings to soldiers for food coupons or soap. Health inspectors struggled to distinguish survival from commerce. The winter storms that flooded roads complicated logistics. Trucks loaded with disinfectant and microscope kits sank in muddy passes. Routine becomes impossible. Harper recorded that January, and so policy becomes rumor. The decision to maintain some licensed premises provoked outrage from both chaplains and political observers. In December 1943, local parishes in Caserta organized a procession demanding closure of immoral houses, carrying banners that read, Per la purezza della patria, for the purity of the homeland. Allied headquarters responded cautiously, citing the necessity to prevent epidemics. Some facilities were discreetly reclassified as health stations A and B. Behind those bureaucratic euphemisms, routine tested endurance, police escorts at every inspection, nurses disinfecting endless basins, doctors filling duplicate forms for Allied and Italian administrations. Harper's letters from that winter reveal exhaustion more than disgust. The cold enters the tents first, the shame after. We stopped feeling both after midnight. The first major shift came with the liberation of Rome in June 1944. The entry of Allied troops unleashed jubilation, then chaos. Bars, cafes, and cinemas reopened overnight, many doubling as unofficial meeting places. Soldiers on temporary leave flooded the capital. Disease rates rose correspondingly. The Allied Control Commission, operating from the Palazzo Margherita, debated emergency measures. A directive issued 12 July 1944 ordered the immediate suppression of public brothels within the city limits, echoing President Roosevelt's insistence that no sanctioned system of prostitution shall stain the Allied cause. Yet outside official circles, the old houses remained active, some under the protection of local police seeking to preserve order through containment. Harper, transferred from Naples to Rome during that summer, found herself visiting those establishments not as visitor, but inspector. The city pretends civility, she noted, but under the marble patience lies fear, a fear that our rules matter less each week. The contrast in terrain also changed her work. Where the desert had been an open stage, Italy's tight streets and layered ruins made secrecy easy. Health teams carried portable lamps and microscopes through courtyards still littered with shell fragments. Electricity failures shortened every shift. Meanwhile, moral debates turned political. Catholic newspapers accused the Allied administration of corrupting youth, while left-wing pamphlets blamed church conservatism for hampering pragmatic hygiene. In this clash, women like Harper became unintended intermediaries, labeled angels by one side and accomplices by the other. She wrote home, paraphrased, "I have learned to read silence, for neither soldier nor patient tells the whole truth." While Italy wrestled with regulation, another front demanded attention. France, after the Normandy landings in June 1944. Medical sections of the U.S. First Army warned of a venereal crisis greater than any yet recorded. Within weeks, emergency prophylactic stations dotted the roadsides of Normandy. The Army coined the phrase pro-station for small tents dispensing chemical disinfectants and lectures on hygiene. Official posters, now iconic, depicted smiling nurses with the slogan, "Don't let disease disarm you." But beyond these controlled nodes, the liberated towns thrummed with uncontrolled reunion. Soldiers, civilians, returning refugees mingling through nights of relief. Captain Adams, transferred from Italy to France by late summer, reported that moral discipline deteriorated faster than supply lines. Rain turned camps into swamps. Laundry could not dry. Medicine spoiled. He estimated 40% of certain units delayed by health quarantines between August and October. The French police cooperated uneasily with Allied medical officers. Pre-war statutes on maisons closes, repealed by 1942, Vichy decrees, and confused further by occupation policies, left a vacuum. Municipal officials improvised by registering street workers and sending them for weekly tests. One Paris inspector's notebook survives in fragments. He accused the Americans of importing Puritan rules without understanding local customs. Statistics remain contested, but by the autumn of 1944, authorities estimated some 200 registered women under police surveillance in the capital, and perhaps double that number unregistered. Among them were displaced persons, war widows, and former collaborators seeking anonymity. For Harper, who followed medical delegations documenting urban measures, the return to continental Europe marked another turning point. She wrote that Paris smelled of perfume and disinfectant in equal measure. Her own emotional landscape shifted as she witnessed the dilemmas of rehabilitation. Earlier, she had approached her assignment as medical necessity. In France, she began to glimpse it as moral theater. One evening, she described walking along Rue Saint-Denis, where beneath broken neon signs, women bargained in multiple languages. English at one price, liberation at another. This line, borrowed from her correspondence, reveals fatigue subdued by irony. Harper was not condemning them. She recognized parallel survival instincts. Still, the repetition of medical routines, scrubbing instruments, explaining precautions in fractured French, wore down sympathy. She privately feared that the campaign's impersonality was itself a contagion. "Perhaps we catch indifference first," she confided. For the civilians she encountered, Allied regulation promised protection, yet seldom delivered. Testing certificates became black market currency. Rumors circulated that negative stamps granted immunity from police harassment. Women lined up outside clinics under the scrutiny of soldiers, their privacy exposed as public record. The friction between liberation and control deepened. French social reformers, such as Martha Richard, a city councillor and former sex worker herself, began campaigning for abolition of brothels, arguing that wartime regulation disguised oppression. Her rhetoric reached city halls by late 1945 and culminated post-war in the closure laws bearing her name. But while she spoke in Paris assemblies, Harper and others were still on the roads, treating infections that policies could neither prevent nor pardon. Meanwhile, news from the Pacific filtered through. Reports of Japanese comfort stations and the abuse of women across Asia. For Allied medics in Europe, the revelations sparked grim reflection. In a letter paraphrased from Harper circa February 1945, she wrote, "We learn what regulation looks like when cruelty runs it." That comparison reinforced among medical officers a sense of moral difference, the idea that Allied regulation, however imperfect, was voluntary and hygienic. Yet even that distinction blurred at times. Rumors spread in Naples that local women confined for medical observation were held under military guard, their release contingent on negative tests. Military headquarters denied coercion, but Red Cross inspectors recorded vague complaints of confinement. Here, the line between control and exploitation thinned dangerously. By early 1945, as Allied troops reached the Rhine and the war neared its climax, disease statistics again featured in briefings alongside casualty counts. In certain divisions, infection rates dropped due to exhaustion and reduced leave. Commanders attributed the decline to discipline. Doctors credited improved prophylaxis access. Harper, who had followed the armies north into Luxembourg, offered another explanation. The men are too tired to seek temptation. Winter cold and the sight of endless ruins subdued appetite more effectively than sermons or confiscations. Her words convey empathy without indulgence, acknowledging desire as a symptom of loneliness rather than corruption. Geography and weather had always shaped the course of these policies. In North Africa, open spaces had allowed isolation and surveillance. In Italy, mountains and urban density undermined control. In Northern Europe, harsh climate enforced abstinence by fatigue. Hinterlands mattered too. Supply chains for medical glassware, soap, and prophylactic chemicals depended on convoys vulnerable to bombing. A broken shipment could paralyze entire districts. Technicians improvised, substituting local alcohols for sterilization and repurposing radio batteries to heat disinfectant. Even science bent under logistical strain. Yet amid shortages, innovation persisted. Research officers experimented with new penicillin applications by 1944, a medical revolution that would eventually displace much of the punitive tone of earlier regulation. At first, however, doses were scarce and reserved for severe cases. Doctors triaged not by moral worth, but by likely usefulness to the front. As Harper dryly observed, the medicine runs shorter than sermons. Administrative contradictions multiplied as Allied units advanced into Germany. Military government orders forbade fraternization with German civilians, threatening punishment under non-fraternization directives issued in April 1945. These rules met immediate defiance. Within weeks of occupation, fraternization charges flooded military courts. In reality, prohibition proved untenable amid daily contact during Reconstruction. Sanitary officers quickly resumed the language of control, launching medical examinations of German women employed by Allied troops as servants or translators. Harper, assigned briefly to one such station near Cologne, left a single surviving note. They bring their children with them, and I no longer know who is protecting whom. The sentence closes her diary before the war's official end in May. Her subsequent service records trace her to a demobilization hospital in England by August. Throughout these months, decisions came not as grand moral verdicts, but as sequences of small adaptations, closures, reopenings, reclassifications. Each choice balanced risk against supposed virtue. Historians later debated whether regulation reduced infection rates or merely redistributed accountability. What remains visible is the lived consequence. Women moved repeatedly between categories: registered, unregistered, interned, liberated, while men oscillated between reprimand and release. For medics like Harper and officers like Adams, the policies bred fatigue indistinguishable from compassion. The more they measured bodies, the less certain they became about the value of measurement itself. When the surrender in Europe finally arrived on 8 May 1945, cities erupted again in light and sound. In the alleys behind the parades, the same clinics still glowed under dim bulbs. Files labeled VD Control Confidential piled up in wooden crates, awaiting shipment to Central Archives. Harper, standing before one of these stacks in a requisitioned schoolhouse, described the noise of celebration outside as like died against a sealed shell. She thought of the countless forms bearing anonymous initials, the bureaucratic ghost of a war fought not in deserts or streets, but in the space between law and longing. And as repatriation orders began to circulate, sanitary officers drafted their final summary. Infection stabilized, morale satisfactory, regulation successful within operational limits. Those phrases would soon underpin peacetime reports, stripped of names, stripped of ambiguity. Yet for those who had enforced and endured those controls, the war had left a different legacy, one carried in silence, paperwork, and memory. That legacy, measured neither in victory nor defeat, would come to define how nations remembered the boundaries they had drawn around desire, and how tenuous those boundaries remained once peace blurred the ink. As the filing crates sealed shut and ships carried them toward London, Washington, and Paris, the men and women who had implemented wartime regulation dispersed quietly. Their work had been neither granted medals nor publicly condemned. Its traces lay in statistics typed on thin paper, some now faded to near invisibility. Archival estimates suggest that between 1941 and 1945, Allied medical services in the Mediterranean and Western Europe treated roughly 400,000 cases of venereal disease among troops. Figures vary by source. Some historians raise the total to nearly 500,000, but all concur that infection never endangered overall military capacity. In the Pacific, recorded cases reached similar proportions. Few individuals died, yet countless reputations did. Civilian women stigmatized by registration, nurses dismissed after accusations of leniency, officers reprimanded for breaches that headquarters preferred not to scrutinize. The immediate military balance sheet declared victory over contagion. The human cost was atomized into unread footnotes. The end of fighting did not mean the end of control. Through 1946 and 1947, demobilization camps in Britain, France, and Italy maintained quarantine wards. Doctors who had once lectured about hygiene now coordinated the repatriation of those categorized as non-compliant women. In France, archival memoranda from the Ministry of Health recount nearly 5,000 individuals confined for medical observation after the liberation, many without formal charges. The Allied Control Commission treated these measures as precautionary. Later inquiries called them excess. Such disputes over numbers and legitimacy mark the boundary between fact and interpretation. We can tally confinements, but not humiliation. To the policymakers drafting post-war health codes, regulation had proved operationally effective. To those who passed through its clinics, it often resembled a prolonged armistice between desire and discipline. Evelyn Harper's trail grows faint after her return to England. One final letter, dated December 1946, paraphrased by her niece, reads, "I spend days filing old reports. The war seems to repeat itself in drawers." She had transferred to a civilian health department, organizing new campaigns against infection among demobilized servicemen. Her tone carries neither anger nor closure, only fatigue and awareness that the apparatus she helped build continued under new names. For her, regulation had dissolved into bureaucracy, the battle transformed into paperwork. When she died in 1972, newspaper notices remembered her as public health pioneer, a phrase both accurate and partial. Within the broader region, the war's patchwork of policies produced contrasting legacies. In Italy, the system of caste use lingered until 1958, sustained by memories of wartime necessity. Its closure under the Merlin Law reflected delayed rejection of state-sanctioned morality. In France, Martha Richard's campaign succeeded in 1946, abolishing brothels, yet leaving unregulated prostitution to endure in less visible forms. Britain, never a land of licensed houses, expanded its social hygiene services, but avoided overt discussion of soldiers' experiences. Across the Pacific, revelations about Japan's coercive comfort stations gradually overshadowed Allied compromises, redefining post-war debates on consent and occupation ethics. Thus, the conclusion of regulatory policy was not uniform cessation, but migration, from military to civilian spheres, from explicit control to administrative silence. Morally, the experience forced armies and governments to confront the conflict between utility and conscience. Strategically, regulation had preserved manpower by curbing disease. Ethically, it cast lingering shadows on the definitions of voluntariness, coercion, and medical authority. Historians attempting to parse motives find themselves between documents of certainty and testimonies of ambiguity. Evidence shows that compulsory health checks reduced infection rates by measurable fractions. Interpretation reveals that coercion, however mild, eroded trust. The military learned medical efficiency, yet society absorbed the more elusive lesson that safeguarding health cannot justify possession of the body. Politics soon turned these complexities into ideology. Cold War propaganda framed Western measures as humane modernity, while denouncing former Axis models as barbaric. But in quieter corners of archives, individual voices resist such extremes. A handwritten note found in an anonymous Red Cross file declares simply, "Purity cannot be policed." From today's perspective, these wartime programs appear as precursors to global health governance, surveillance systems, vaccination drives, sexual education campaigns. The infrastructure first assembled to manage soldiers' intimacy evolved into the institutional language of public health. Understanding this lineage requires acknowledging the contradiction of its birth, a science conceived amid secrecy and moral strain. Modern codes emphasizing privacy and affirmation arose partly in response to the wounds left by coercive testing and registration. Thus, wartime regulation functioned as both origin and caution. Its success in controlling infection measured only one dimension of its failure to respect autonomy. In retrospect, the political dimension was equally profound. By imposing health administration upon occupied or allied territories, the major powers rehearsed new forms of governance that mixed medical expertise with moral authority. In North Africa, the continuation of French colonial sanitary systems foreshadowed post-war debates on decolonization. To what extent could local populations reclaim control over their own bodies and laws? In Europe, the transnational coordination of disease statistics became a prototype for later World Health Organization procedures. Thus, out of a network meant to regulate prostitution, emerged the first skeletal frame of international health cooperation, a paradox of progress born from constraint. Harper's generation rarely voiced such abstractions. For them, the end of war brought only the slow fading of uniforms, the sound of drawers closing on sealed files. Yet her modest record preserves an undercurrent of reflection. She once wrote, after a post-war inspection in Marseille, paraphrased, "I know now that even the cleanest order cannot wash what war leaves behind." Those words reveal an understanding sharper than any directive, that policies attempting to regulate human vulnerability often magnify it instead. In the aftermath, numbers remain safer to discuss than memories. Analysts cited declining infection rates, down to less than 2% among Allied troops by 1946, as proof of success. But memory clings to more intangible figures. The women who vanished into clinics, the medics who questioned orders, the local officials caught between gratitude and resentment. Across continents, individual stories echoed one another in forgetting. For decades, military archives labeled their files simply sanitation. Behind that neutral term lay an emotional topography that no statistic could flatten. What, then, does the episode offer beyond historical curiosity? Perhaps an uneasy recognition that every attempt at order carries the risk of moral anesthesia. The same bureaucratic logic that sought to protect soldiers also trained administrators to view flesh as data. At the same time, the persistence of individuals like Harper and countless unnamed doctors, nurses, and patients embodies resistance to dehumanization, not rebellion by shouting, but by measuring gently, by remembering that care has meaning only when freely given. As the 20th century progressed, new conflicts repeated the argument under different names: peacekeeping hygiene, humanitarian zones, health corridors. Each reformer inherits traces of that wartime paradox. If regulation once aimed to preserve armies, perhaps its lasting task is to remind societies to defend dignity with equal vigilance. When one revisits the faint ink of those wartime reports, they read less as confessions of guilt than warnings drafted in administrative language. They whisper of a truth Harper hinted at half a lifetime ago: that law can circumscribe behavior, but compassion alone redeems survival. The last page of her saved notebook carries no figures, only a description of the sea during her voyage home. The water shone as if rinsed of memory. I closed my eyes and heard the engines like steady breathing. It is not an image of triumph, but of release. The sound of a world trying to cleanse itself from its own necessity. And when the engines fade, one question remains, hovering above each archived form and each unnamed life. After total war has regulated even desire, what part of humanity can still claim to be free?